Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 332 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about the New York Knicks trading for big man Karl Anthony Towns. Two teams that are on the up and up coming into this NBA season are the New York Knicks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Knicks, for the second year in a row, made it to the second round, and for the first time since 2004, the T-Wolves made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. Yet despite that success, both teams have decided to shake things up. The Knicks are trading Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, Keita Bates-Diop, and a future first-round pick, and get back Karl Anthony Towns, while the third team in this trade, the Hornets, get Charlie Brown, Daquan Jeffries, Dwayne Washington Jr., and 3 second-round picks. I want to start by talking about the idea that this is one of the most surprising trades in NBA history, and I get that line of thinking. This trade came out of nowhere, but then I look at who is the head coach of the New York Knicks, Tom Thibodeau, who loves to bring in players he's coached before. He coached Derrick Rose and Taj Gibson on 3 different teams, Jimmy Butler on 2 different teams, and for the second time he will be coaching Karl Anthony Towns. This is what Tibbs does. If he has coached a player before, there is a good chance he will coach that player again. Let's talk about Karl Anthony Towns as a player. Statistically, he's 22.9 points per game, 10.8 rebounds per game, and is a career 39% three-point shooter. To put that into perspective, that's higher than both Kevin Durant and Dirk Nowitzki. My feeling on Towns as a player is that he is a star, not a superstar. What he and the Knicks are hoping is history repeats itself. The last 2 times the Wolves traded away a star big, that player went on to win a ring with his next team. Kevin Garnett with the Boston Celtics and Kevin Love with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And what's really interesting about both of those trades is that those 2 star players had to defer to other stars joining their new teams. Kevin Garnett now had to play with Paul Pierce and Ray Allen, and Kevin Love had to play with LeBron James and Kyrie Irving, and they were successful in doing so, obviously. Here's why I'm a little frustrated with the New York Knicks. They think they need another star player. I like the addition of Mikal Bridges, and Jalen Brunson is your superstar. Instead of bringing in Cat, I might have traded Randle for depth and re-signed Isaiah Hartenstein, who signed with OKC. I like the idea of them being a really deep team with one superstar player, but instead they bring in Cat, and I just don't know how he's going to fit in with Brunson. It didn't work between him and Andrew Wiggins, him and D'Angelo Russell, and over the last few years in Minnesota, it became Anthony Edwards' team. That's something I really like about this trade from Minnesota's perspective. The Timberwolves are now all about Anthony Edwards. Yes, they have Julius Randle, they have Rudy Gobert, they have Naz Reid, but I really like the fact that Anthony Edwards is now the de facto man of that team. Now, that being said, what really annoys me about the Minnesota Timberwolves is this need for multiple big men. They still have way too many bigs on that roster. You still have Rudy Gobert, now you have Julius Randle, you have Naz Reid, you have way too many bigs. The teams that are winning NBA championships lately have not been the teams with multiple really good big men. I'm sorry, that's just not how they're winning. The Boston Celtics had Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford. They weren't super deep with their other bigs. I just think Minnesota has too many bigs on the roster still. I do like the addition of DiVincenzo. He's an energy guy who has won a ring with the Milwaukee Bucks, and last season averaged 15 points per game and shot 40% from 3. Ultimately, how you feel about this trade is going to come down to how you feel about these 2 players, Karl Anthony Towns and Julius Randle. Now, when it comes to Karl Anthony Towns, there was tremendous pressure on him from the get-go. He really came into his own. He's been a star player for a while, but there is something missing from his game where you're like, this guy should be a top 10 player, but he's never quite reached that full potential. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of down on him when Jimmy Butler called him out and then went to Miami and led that team to the NBA Finals. What he said about Karl Anthony Towns felt true because he had success somewhere else. That kind of made Karl Anthony Towns look bad. And in the case of Julius Randle, his time with the New York Knicks Knicks is really interesting because he was banished from the Lakers after they got rid of a bunch of young players. Remember, they got rid of Jordan Clarkson, they got rid of D'Angelo Russell, and they got rid of Julius Randle. And then Randle began to develop into his own with the Pelicans and then really became an all-star caliber player with the New York Knicks. If I was going to compare Randle to any past New York Knicks player, it would be Amare Stoudemire. Amare Stoudemire goes to the Knicks and for a short time period was their best player, helped them get into the playoffs, but then when Carmelo Anthony comes, he gets overshadowed. That's exactly what happened with Julius Randle. Randle gets there, becomes a star player, and then in walks Jalen Brunson and overshadows Randle and becomes the face of the franchise. But it makes all the sense in the world why that happened, because Jalen Brunson is a point guard in today's NBA. Those are the guys dominating the league, not these bigs. So I am a little confused as to why you would trade your star big for another star big. Like, I think Karl Anthony Towns is a better player, but how much better? Does he get you to a championship level? I don't think so. That's not how I feel about Karl Anthony Towns. I think he's a difference maker. How much of a difference maker in the playoffs? I don't know. It's just a weird trade on paper. I mean, they're basically the same age. Randle is 29, Towns is 28. Like, there's not just a big difference here. And yes, I think Towns is the player who has the better pedigree, the bigger name. Like, more people have higher expectations of Karl Anthony Towns. But Julius Randle has been very good during his time with the New York Knicks. For this trade to be successful for the Knicks, it's going to come down to how does Towns fit with Jalen Brunson, the absolute face of the organization. And one of my fears with this trade is Karl Anthony Towns going to be accepting of the fact that the Knicks might not need him to average 20 points per game and 10 rebounds per game? Like, if you're not a 20-10 guy, are you going to be upset? Because there's a lot of guys on that team who need to get the ball. Mikal Bridges is not a slouch either. He's a really good offensive player who last year averaged nearly 20 points per game. I mean, not all three of these guys are going to average 20. Brunson is going to get most of the shots for the New York Knicks. It's going to come down to Towns and Bridges. Who becomes the Robin to Jalen Brunson's Batman? I haven't even mentioned the name OG Anunoby, who the New York Knicks gave a lot of money to, and Josh Hart. I mean, those are a lot of guys who need to score the basketball. Is there going to be enough shots for all of these guys? I mean, who is going to be the guy on this roster who really sacrifices for the good of the team? Now, it's not going to be Jalen Brunson. He's going to be a 25 points per game scorer. Is it going to be Bridges? Is it going to be Anunoby? Is it going to be Karl Anthony Towns? Like, I'm just interested to see this all come together for the New York Knicks. I'm not saying it's going to be a failure. I'm just interested to see if they're going to be a better team than they were last year. I haven't quite made up my mind if this trade makes them an NBA Finals contender. I don't know if this puts them on the level of the Boston Celtics or even the Philadelphia 76ers, who traded for Paul George. The Sixers are a deeper team than the Knicks. They have George and Embiid, then they have Tyrese Maxey, Caleb Martin, Eric Gordon, Andre Drummond, and Kelly Oubre. And getting back to the T-Wolves, it really doesn't move the needle that much for me on them whatsoever. You still feel great about Anthony Edwards. You believe they can get right back to the Western Conference Finals because of him. Maybe Julius Randle is going to be a better fit. I just don't know. It's kind of a wait and see thing with both of these players on their new teams. What's interesting about all of the takes on this trade is I haven't heard anybody say it might end up working out for both teams. Maybe the Knicks are going to get the absolute best out of Karl Anthony Towns, and maybe the T-Wolves are going to get the best out of Julius Randle. Now, here is something that might make you really happy if you're a fan of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Julius Randle is basically going to be playing for a contract extension. He has 1 year, $33 million left on his deal, and then a player option for $30 million. You know he's an NBA player. He wants a long-term deal, and he's going to play like a star to try to get that contract. He's going to play out of his mind at some point because the money is right there. It's that obvious obvious when you look at these players. You go, who is going to be an impending free agent? Oh, that guy is about to ball out. Well, on the other hand, Karl Anthony Towns is signed for the next 3 years, where he will be making $49, $53, and $57 million. This is not a guy playing for a new contract. That's maybe something that's beneficial to the Minnesota Timberwolves, is that Randle is going to be hungry for his next long-term deal. That's one of the biggest reasons I'm super high on the Miami Heat coming into the NBA season, because Jimmy Butler is looking for a contract extension. You've seen Jimmy Butler when he is playing for something like a contract. He plays out of his mind. The same thing might happen with Julius Randle on the Minnesota Timberwolves. This is one of those rare NBA trades where we just can't tell who the ultimate winner is going to be until we see both of these teams play. This isn't like when the Raptors traded Kawhi Leonard for DeMar DeRozan and we were all like, oh, the Raptors clearly won that trade. We knew that the Raptors won that trade even before they won the NBA Finals with Kawhi Leonard. As good as Karl Anthony Towns has been, I just don't put him on such a higher level than Julius Randle. I think he is a better player, but he's not a far superior player, and they do have similar skill sets. They are big men who are decent at shooting three-pointers. Now, Karl Anthony Towns has been way more consistent shooting from deep than Julius Randle. I mean, Randle for his career is 33%. That's a lot lower than 39%. And Randle has only shot over 40% from three one time in his career. Yes, Towns is way more efficient than Julius Randle is as a player. When you look at the other bigs around the league, like I put Towns, of course, lower than Nikola Jokic. I put him lower than Anthony Davis, Joel Embiid. And then there are these guys he's higher than, but I don't think there's a big difference between them. Bam Adebayo is lower than Karl Anthony Towns, but is he that much worse as a player? No. And then Julius Randle. Like, Julius Randle has proven himself to be a difference maker in the NBA. He is an all-star caliber player. My point is, maybe the New York Knicks don't need either of these guys. Maybe they don't need Julius Randle, and maybe they didn't need Karl Anthony Towns. Like I was saying earlier, maybe you trade away Julius Randle, you get some pieces back, and then you re-sign Hartenstein, who was a really good rebounder, a really good defensive center. Maybe that's all you need when you have Jalen Brunson. You let Jalen Brunson be that guy who averages 25 and 30, and then you let everyone else be role players. I don't believe that Karl Anthony Towns is willing to be a role player. He views himself as a superstar player, even though he's a star player. And if I'm the Timberwolves, if I was going to move on from Karl Anthony Towns, I maybe would have traded him for a point guard. I mean, I have Mike Conley, but he's an aging player. Like, maybe get the point guard of the future. Now, I don't know if the Hawks would have ever done this trade, but maybe I would have gone to the Atlanta Hawks and said, here, give me Trae Young and I'll trade you back Karl Anthony Towns. Maybe that's the kind of trade that I would have been really excited about if I were the Minnesota Timberwolves. Could you imagine a backcourt that included Trae Young and Anthony Edwards? Now, that would have gotten me excited. Julius Randle, I think it's interesting. Again, I talked about the fact that he's going to be playing for a contract, but the move just doesn't excite me. It doesn't move the needle. For me to believe in either of these two teams moving forward, I'm going to have to see it on the court. I'm going to have to see these players bring it to another level, and that's something we've been waiting for a while for Karl Anthony Towns. When is he going to play like a top 10 player in the NBA? And I've just gone to a point where I don't believe he is capable of reaching that level. He's a star player. He's a perennial all-star. He'll put up big numbers, but then at the end of the day, I just don't believe that he can be a difference maker on a championship winning team until I see it for myself. I do think it's wild the T-Wolves move on from Towns after making the Western Conference Finals. A team that hadn't been to the Western Conference Finals since 2004 moves on from their second best player weeks before the season starts. That is wild, but there's a lot of weirdness going on with the T-Wolves. We don't even really know who the owner owner of the team is it Glenn Taylor or is it going to be former baseball star Alex Rodriguez? What's really interesting about this trade is both of these fan bases were really happy with where these two teams were going. I mean, the Knicks fans were loving the fact that they had a roster full of former Villanova players with Jalen Brunson, now with Mikal Bridges, Josh Hart, DiVincenzo. They were loving it, and now you get rid of that goodwill. Like, it's really interesting that these two teams at this point decided to make a move, and it's really going to have to pay off, because if these teams suffer early first-round exits in the playoffs, both of these fan bases are going to be scratching their heads saying, why on earth did we make this trade? I mean, there's a real scenario where this doesn't work out for either team. I'm just kind of worried what the impact of this trade will have on Jalen Brunson now that he has a star big man who views himself as a star in Karl Anthony Towns. Like, I think Julius Randle was willing to defer to Jalen Brunson and let him be the face of the New York Knicks. Let him be the sole superstar. I'm not sure that Karl Anthony Towns is at that point in his career to defer to somebody like that. I mean, was he really deferring to Anthony Edwards, or did he view him as co-stars of that team in Minnesota? I don't think Julius Randle is going to walk into Minnesota and act like he's on the same level as Anthony Edwards. That's what I like about this trade. Anthony Edwards is the alpha on that team, the sole superstar player, something I think should have happened with the New York Knicks. You have a lot of nice players, and then you have your one superstar. But no, the Knicks think they have a superstar, and the problem might be Karl Anthony Towns is not a superstar. I also just don't think that this trade fills a weakness for either team. I mean, you're just trading for another big who shoots a lot of frees. Now, I think the weakness in Julius Randle's game is that he will chuck up a lot of shots even when he's not having a good game. Like, that's a real weakness. And then with Towns, I kind of feel like in the past his numbers have been kind of hollow because he hasn't really gotten the job done in crunch time. One thing this trade has done is made me more interested in where both of these two teams are headed. Like, I am intrigued where the New York Knicks are going to end up. The Tom Thibodeau reuniting with his former stars has kind of been a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, when he was reuniting with Derrick Rose, that was post-injury Derrick Rose, so he wasn't the same player. Then with Jimmy Butler, we all know what ended up happening in Minnesota when he asked for that trade. I mean, that didn't really work out. So that's something to keep an eye on. Tom Thibodeau clearly wants to coach Karl Anthony Towns again, but does Karl Anthony Towns want to be coached by Tom Thibodeau again? I mean, this is a demanding coach. And I know what I'm about to say is a big cliche, but Karl Anthony Towns is going to a massive, massive market in New York. They don't talk about basketball in Minnesota the same way they talk about basketball in New York, the same way they love guys like Patrick Ewing. It's going to be a bit of a different climate for Karl Anthony Towns playing for the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden. Like, is he going to be able to play well under all of that scrutiny? And if he's not, how is he going to deal with that? The clear-cut winner of this trade is going to be whichever team makes it further in the NBA playoffs. That's what this is going to come down to. If Julius Randle is the missing piece to the T-Wolves making or even winning the NBA Finals, then the T-Wolves will be the victors of this trade. And the same goes for Karl Anthony Towns with the New York Knicks. If he is the missing piece to the Knicks winning an NBA championship, the Knicks will win this trade. It's as simple as that. It's not about which player is better. It's about which player is going to make the bigger difference on their new teams. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say right now my early pick is Julius Randle because he is the one playing for a new contract. Never take that for granted. A player playing for a new contract. This is a guy who wants that next payday. He wants to get that max contract. Julius Randle, I believe, is going to play at an all-star level for the T-Wolves and make a bigger difference in his new team than Karl Anthony Towns does with his. That's my prediction. Maybe I'll end up being wrong, but right now I like this trade more from the side of the Minnesota Timberwolves. I do love it when these big trades come out of nowhere. I mean, last year we all knew that at one point Dame Lillard was going to be traded. We just didn't know when. It's way more fun and exciting when a trade like this comes out of nowhere, especially a complicated trade like this where two two really good players are moved in the same deal. Karl Towns and Julius Randle. It's also just fun to think about the possibility that these two teams could meet in the NBA Finals. I mean, could you imagine the NBA Finals seeing the New York Knicks versus the T-Wolves, seeing Julius Randle go up against his former team and Karl Towns against his? I mean, that's the kind of thing you think about when it comes to these wild trades. But deep down, NBA fans know that usually these trades don't work out for everyone. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.